Don't make these top 5 budgeting mistakes. Look, avoid these budgeting setbacks or you'll remain stuck. Don't budget. Do this instead to grow your wealth and life. See, the top 5 mistakes with budgeting are not valuing your time, maybe automating the wrong things, not separating accounts, and not differentiating expenses. But ultimately, you can't shrink your way to wealth. So you know what? Fast money wins. Create some momentum. I mean, the first thing to do is eliminate any destructive expenses. Have some visibility. I tested Rocket Money today. Just downloaded the app, canceled a few subscriptions. That's one thing. But more importantly is to increase productive expenses. For me, productive expenses could be running ads on What Would the Rockefellers Do, my book, or when I hired my head copywriter, or hiring an enrollment director to get people into our programs, or adding AI tools to support the Rockefeller method, or even rewriting my books like What Would the Rockefellers Do and Killing Sacred Cows to get the message out there. See, recklessness won't work, but fast money wins. So let's find the areas that are slowing you down, maybe the ones holding you back, and put some money in your pocket and have that enjoyment along the way. Here's a fast money tip. Go to missingmoney.com to find out if you have any money that's unclaimed. Become state property. Maybe you moved, you changed your address. So you go to missingmoney.com and find money that's rightfully yours. I've done this over and over again. Sometimes it might be an old bank account that only had money in savings and was inactive, or maybe when you moved and there was a check that came your way as a business owner and it didn't ever get to you. So they just hold it as, state property, or the government holds on to it and you can reclaim it. See, look, there's just kind of a ream when it comes to budgeting. And maybe budgeting gets both too much credit and too much blame. Maybe it's really us and how we see budgeting, how we view money. You see, how we view money is entirely different depending on our current circumstances or mood, or maybe it's simply our upbringing, our age, or even marital status. For example, what's the difference between frugal and cheap? I think it's all just timing and perspective. When you're married, you don't spend money. That's frugal. But spend no money when you're dating, you're cheap. Frugal is when it's your money. Cheap is when someone else won't foot the bill. Frugal is what they say to your face. Cheap's what they say behind your back. I think frugal is buying that ultra soft toilet paper when it's on sale. Cheap's buying that stuff that's so thin it can barely pick up a donut or feels like sandpaper on your ass. See, if you found this opening segment funny, you're frugal. If you didn't, you're cheap. It's all perspective. Look, I'm a recovering miser. When I was in my teens and in my early 20s, budgeting was my obsession. And kind of like The Millionaire Next Door, that book was my money Bible. I remember some of the Christmas gifts I bought my wife. One was a clearance bin, 99-cent phone case that didn't even fit her damn phone. Or when we were first getting married, I'm like, here's our budget per month for an apartment. And you know what? She went out, and as a smart ass that she is, she found an apartment for that budget. It was pretty frightening. I didn't know there was a ghetto in Utah, but she found it. There were kids running around in the street in their diapers, not being changed. There were people smoking weed and drinking 40s in the middle of the day during a work week. I mean, that's the problem with a budgeting mindset, is we start to cut out too much at the expense of being more productive ourselves. I even remember my wife was a teacher, and we were fighting over her money. She was spending money on the classroom. I was like, babe, you're supposed to earn money as a teacher, not spend it. See, that's a mindset that could be pretty destructive. It all kind of changed for me when I was, I was getting this $1 Million Round Table Award. I'd sold a bunch of life insurance in my early 20s, and I'm in Las Vegas at the MDRT annual event, get this award. I'm so damn proud. And I'm out in the hallway, and I run into this woman, Nancy Ogilvy, and she was actually part of the financial team for Robert Kiyosaki. And I just barely started reading Rich Dad Poor Dad, so I was pretty fascinated. And I was talking to her, and I'm like, you know what? I can't wait till we save up X amount of money, then I'll consider a home. And when we have this much money saved up, then we can start thinking about having kids. And everything in my life was put on hold. And I remember she asked me a few questions, and as I answered them, she goes, I can't wait for you to get to this next level when you see that people view money differently, that wealth is a different mindset than this budgeting mindset that you're in. And I was like, well, tell me more. And as I answered these questions, we had this conversation. She's like, well, I wonder what it's like living in the financial prison that you've built for your wife. I was like, oh, damn. Budgeting kind of made me an asshole, right? And it was that moment. I actually leaned up on this pillar and sat down and called my wife. And I was like, babe, I'm sorry. I've been a dick. I've been a jerk. Everything's been this obsession about budgeting and what we could cut out, what we could eliminate. And there's been no room for enjoyment. And that's not what it was like when we dated. We were in college. It wasn't like I had an abundance of money at the time. But as soon as we got married, budgeting was a key factor at making me an asshole. Look, what's crazy is it's estimated that around 60 to 80% of budgets actually fell. I guess it really just depends on the study or the context, but the failure rate can be different based upon if it's individuals or businesses. Hell, we know governments struggle with it. The Pentagon, they haven't ever balanced a budget ever, and they just say, oh, there's billions of dollars we can't account for. But the general reasons for failure tend to be consistent across any type of budget. When it comes to personal budgets and individuals, it's around 60 to 70% of individuals abandon their budget within the first few months due to unrealistic expectations or lack of tracking. Well, then, if that's the case, why are these promoted so heavily and yet letting so many people down? It's because budgeting is actually at odds with building wealth. Let's look at the top 5 budgeting mistakes. The first one, not valuing your time. What is your time worth? If it's always about how you can find the best deals and you're analyzing and researching to save the most money. You know, when I was first in business and I would take like 2 layovers sometimes to get to a place. I'd fly on budget airlines, even sit in the middle seat sometimes. And for some that might be fine. I'm 6'3". It wasn't really great. And there's a lot of time that was lost in that. So part of how we have to look at it is there's really like 3 measures of wealth or of worth. There's price, which is what we pay. And most of the time, budgeting only really considers the price. And as Jay-Z would say, some people know the price of everything and not the value of anything. So let's look at price and cost versus value. So cost is the economic piece. There's sometimes we might be saving pennies and losing dollars. Some people try to do taxes on their own, or they look for the cheapest employees, or they look for ways to do everything so that they don't ever have to pay anyone else. And those things aren't the highest leverage things. They're not the highest quality things that they could be doing with their time. And so even though they are saving those pennies, they are losing those dollars, and it requires a lot of energy. And sometimes that leads to procrastination and frustration, and it diminishes energy. Now, there might be a time where you have to be more resourceful because you don't have the resources, but if that becomes who you are and it's all about what you can save, we start to delay what we can create. And the creation of value is the key to wealth. So there's price is what we pay. Cost is the economic impact. You could have a low price airline ticket with multiple layovers, like I said, but the cost is high because of your energy. You may be taking terrible times and it's interrupting your sleep, or you can't do your workouts or whatever it might be. But what we have to look at is, what is the economic cost? So there's certain things that might have a high price and a low cost. When I think about having a tax attorney, that's a high price, but it's a low cost because it saves me so much more money in taxes by making that investment. Now, the third piece of this measure of worth is value. Value is our feeling of satisfaction, of fulfillment, of enjoyment, and budgeting often doesn't take that into consideration. It's just about elimination. So I'm going to say it again, saving pennies and losing dollars. So start to value your time. What are the things that are the most leverageable? What is the highest skill set? What adds the most value? What serves the most people? What solves the biggest problems? It's a very finite game when we're stuck in budgeting. Putting money in a certain envelope or a certain jar, expending all this energy trying to eliminate. And that's how I started. That's how I started in life. I bought into that. I was like obsessed with it to the point where I wasn't thinking about value creation. And I did this exercise where I just spent an entire weekend. And I was like, I'm just going to look at ways to cut out expenses. And by doing that, I cut out a few expenses. I actually tried that today. And I found out that, there was a supplement that was on automatic shipment, and I only really needed one, and it was 2 different ones because it's coming every 2 weeks. It come once a month. Okay, so that saved me a few bucks. I also had 2 things I was subscribed to. I didn't even know what they were. I wasn't benefiting from them anymore. One was Adobe. I wasn't using this additional suite of services, so I was able to eliminate that. Another had something to do with a technology we used to use for one of the websites that we weren't using anymore. So those are destructive expenses. I'm not using them. It's just costing me. So that's important. But then I remember early on, I was like, I'm just going to take a weekend. I'm going to really focus on vision. I'm going to focus on goals. I'm going to focus on the value I could create. what I found was there was exponentially more that I could create than eliminate. See, when I called my wife and I actually got pretty emotional, apologized, thankfully she was like, it's okay. Although she said later, our first year of marriage was kind of the hardest because I was so obsessed with budgeting. I was so bought in that there was no room for enjoyment. That's a tough situation. There was arguments about the budget, about the money we're spending. I remember in our apartment, I was like, why is the heating bill so high? We need to reduce this. And so it was all of these inconveniences in order to save money that prevented me from thinking about value. Value is the game. Value is the key. See, money doesn't follow effort. Money follows value. And so if we limit our value because all of our effort is spent on eliminating things and cutting back and being in constraint, reduction isn't the game. Production is a better game. So that is an absolute key. And I remember telling my wife, I was like, why don't we go look for a home? Now, the first home that we bought, the entire price of the home was less than I made that year. So it was well within reason. And we started to make more money. I started to host study groups at our house. I used to have friends that come over and we'd host monthly parties before we had kids. And this was a lot of fun and it brought enjoyment and it made my energy increase. And so it was something my wife enjoyed. We actually got to have this quality of life together. We lived there for 9 years. It was an amazing home. Hosted poker nights once a month with my friends. I sucked at poker, but it was still fun to have everybody over. Couldn't do that in our tiny apartment. Now, there was nothing wrong with living in an apartment. It was the mindset that was being so small of just saving money instead of, again, thinking of this game of how do I add more value? How do I produce more? How do I get more creative? And so if your budgetary mindset prevents you from ever taking a trip or going on vacation, I mean, I remember our first vacation that we took as a couple when we had our son. I mean, I brought food on the trip. We didn't really leave the hotel. I remember saying, San Diego's not that cool. It's not that cool if you just stay in the hotel, or every time you go somewhere, you're like, we're not gonna get any food because it's too expensive at SeaWorld, or it's too expensive at Legoland, or all these kind of things. And so the entire trip was around how to eliminate spending too much money. And see, that takes an extraordinary effort, and it's just not very fun. The second big mistake in budgeting, automating the wrong things. A lot of times people feel like they're saving money when they're investing. So I think it's important to automate our savings. Pay yourself first. Set money aside right out the gate. But if that's automatically going into things that are variable, volatile, where economic turmoil can impact it, it's not actually savings because you can't get to it. It's important to have a peace of mind fund. Now, peace of mind fund is, some people might call it an emergency fund, but I don't want to have an emergency to tap into this. There's value in having a savings account, even if it's not earning a high interest rate, because number one, I can raise deductibles on my insurances. Because if I have the savings, I can pay for the inconsequential things without having the risk of raising insurance premiums or rates. So I can save by increasing deductibles or having longer elimination periods on my disability policy. It's more money in my pocket, and then I just insure the catastrophic things, not the inconsequential. Now, having enough savings, that can impact peace of mind, because if you have a health issue, or maybe you change a career, or maybe you have a cash flow crunch in a business, or maybe you just want to dedicate some time to family because something happens that was unexpected and you want to be there for that person, death of a loved one, things like that. Now, having a peace of mind fund might leave you trapped where you can't really take time to go do those other things. So instead of just automating your investing, automate your savings to build a wealth capture account. Well, let's talk about that. That's the third big mistake, is people budget, but they don't have multiple accounts. And we don't have multiple accounts. It's easy for those accounts to get commingled. I think of commingling like when my son used to love chocolate milk, and he's like, okay, you put the chocolate in the milk, and as soon as you stir it, it's commingled. It's chocolate milk. I can't unring that bell. I can't undo that. And sometimes that's what happens to people's finances. So this peace of mind fund, I kind of look at it like wealth capture. Pay yourself first. Set that money aside before you spend on anything else. Then you live off whatever's left over. And if you are in a place where you can live off whatever's left over, there's no reason to budget because you're in mindful cash management. Look at that daily, look at that weekly at least, and see that you're not going out of bounds, right? But then you can even look at wealth creation accounts. Now, wealth creation account is a savings account. It's taxable. It's very flexible, which is nice. It's not earning a very high interest rate. It doesn't come with many benefits. So I liked my wealth creation account to be a properly structured, optimally funded, mutual life insurance, whole life policy. because that cash value in the short term, it's not going to be as good as a savings account, just cash on cash. But over time, you're going to get 5-10 times more interest through dividends than you would get just in an interest that's taxable in a savings account. Plus, you get a death benefit. That permanent death benefit might mean you can reduce and eliminate term insurance, which is money back into your pocket. You're not paying taxes on that increase, so you get to save that money inside of that account. You can use it along the way, but again, with a permanent death benefit, if you become disabled, you can have waiver of premium, so the premiums still get paid, which isn't going to happen in a savings account. Once the dividend's paid, it becomes guaranteed. It's protected from liability and lawsuit in over 40 states, 100%, and partially protected every state. So it's just a more efficient way or effective way to have savings. Now, another account I highly recommend is a living wealthy account. A living wealthy account is if you've automatically paid yourself first. And my recommendation is to work towards 15%. Now, how do you get to 15%? Well, there's ways to do that without having to crush your lifestyle. Most people overpay on their taxes, and that can help them with their wealth creation account. Most people, they don't know how to structure loans properly, and they overpay on interest. But if you renegotiate interest rates, especially with credit cards because you have a good credit score, if you simply refinance with things that have collateral, like a car loan is a lower interest rate than a credit card or a mortgage, that could be really effective as well. So how you handle your interest is a really big deal. And if you have a whole life policy, you can utilize that cash value instead of having to borrow money from institutions where it could impact your credit. It doesn't impact your credit, and you can get to it any time that there's cash value in there. So that could be a much better way to handle things and put more money in your pocket. But I'm talking about 15% even in how you design your insurances. So whether it's the IRS, interest, or even the fees and commissions on investments that we recapture and put into your wealth creation account, that means you're going to have more money along the way simply by being a little bit savvy and plugging financial leaks. Now, 15% is because, taxes might increase in the future, so we're allocating 3 to 15% for that. Planned obsolescence, things break down. We have to replace them. I had a Viking dishwasher once. I felt like it never cleaned our dishes, even though that's supposed to be a good brand. I always thought of it as like little Vikings licking the plates, but not quite getting it clean. So we had to replace that. That's planned obsolescence. Maybe a new washer or something like that. These are things that break down over time and you replace them. So another 3% for planned obsolescence. 3% for propensity to consume. Let me say that more easily. A luxury once enjoyed becomes a necessity. My wife and I kind of joke because in our early years, we didn't really know what good restaurants were versus cheap restaurants. And maybe ignorance was bliss back then, but wasn't the healthiest of food, even though it was cheap. And so, once we started to enjoy a little bit nicer dining, when I first got married, my wife was into like tacos. We still are, but, she'd go get maybe pizza or burgers or stuff like that. It was just really kind of immature, inexperienced palate because we were young when we got married. But then we went to some nice restaurants, and it's hard to go back once that happens, or having organic food. So as time goes on, you might learn about the higher quality of life, and you're like, oh, I'd like to continue to have that. So we want to have some money set aside for that. So we're at 9% between planned obsolescence, between propensity to consume, and also let me add another 3% for the taxes I talked about. Those could go up in time, and we want to make sure to be able to have more money in the future in case taxes raise. There's another 3%. Simply because of inflation. We know inflation's way higher than 3%. That's why there's other factors in here as well. But that's an important thing to consider. So planned obsolescence. And then the last one, technological change. There's things that we buy today that didn't even exist in the past. And there's going to be new inventions in the future that we want to buy. So this is the 15% that you want to set aside. Now, if you can't get there, any amount is good to start with. Maybe you're drowning in debt or you have cash flow issues. Still get in the habit of building liquidity, because if you don't have it, you're going to get in worse situations in the future. It's the habits along the way. So there's a thing called Parkinson's Law. It was first kind of tested with when people were, looking at time and for business owners saying, hey, I want to get this project done. I'm going to tell someone to get it done Friday by 5. What they found is time kind of expanded if it wasn't planned for. And that most people would start getting that done Friday late in the day rather than starting to work on it along the way because there wasn't space for it. Now they started to test this with money. If people had a rise in income, their expenses would rise to meet or exceed that increase because of Parkinson's Law. So paying yourself first is absolutely critical. 15% is what you're going to work towards, and you can be more efficient and plug your financial leaks to get there. And then ultimately, when you've paid yourself first and you left the rest, that's great, but having a living wealthy account says, what about enjoying life along the way? You've saved money Now put money in even a separate account that's your living wealthy account, which is guilt-free spending, value-based spending, maybe things that people see as a luxury or a waste of money, but you actually enjoy it. Maybe that's a good meal, or maybe that's a good wine, or maybe that's a trip that you want to take, or the types of clothes that you buy. It's just rewarding you saying, look, I'm in this mindful cash management mindset. I'm setting money aside. Why don't I find money to enjoy life along the way? Not just wait for one day someday and retirement, but now and in the future. That living wealthy account, that could be so instrumental. One of my wealthiest clients, I mean, you would never know how wealthy he was because he never really enjoyed his wealth. And I remember we found this strategy that if he just bought his inventory with a Plum card, it would give him $120,000 a month. Now, maybe for some people this would be 120 or 1,200 or 12,000. So don't let the numbers be the issue here. It's more the philosophy. And I said, look, I'm going to show you the strategy, but I want you to take 12,000 to 15,000 a month of this recapture and put it in an account and just spend it on things you enjoy. He was very good with donating money and doing a lot of things, but he's like, I don't even know what I'd spend it on. What do you think I should do? I'm like, well, saw you on TV, probably time for a new wardrobe. So his first month, he took the $12,000 to $15,000, hired a personal shopper at a Nordstrom, and bought clothes that he loved, that he enjoyed. It made him feel wealthier. And then I saw him several months later, and he had put in a nice Nest system at his house that he can control from his phone. And then he put in an amazing sound system he was really excited about. He started to do things that had him feel better along the way. I think that budgeting can be at odds with our best life. Now, for those people that are spending way more money than they make, budgeting is probably the short-term answer. But for those that are buying into mindful cash management, that could be absolutely so freeing for you. And then taking some money, you're like, this is stuff that you just get to enjoy. What would life look like if you're living wealthy along the way? All right, so the next piece, and this one's so critical, I've kind of mentioned it, but it's that no one shrinks their way to wealth. I'm going to say that again, no one shrinks their way to wealth. See, we always hear about living within our means, and that's good advice, but there's more than one way to live within your means. Now, one way could be what most people think, and when I say it, what do you think about? Cutting back, budgeting, reducing expenses, scrimping, saving, sacrificing and delaying and deferring. That's what most people think about. And they think of expense as almost like this negative or bad word. Like, expense, it's something to avoid or to eliminate. But guess what? Your income is someone else's expense and vice versa. Your expenses are someone else's income. And anyone could make something really cheap, but if that's what we're voting with our dollars, we're voting for less than the best. So this value-based spending, guilt-free spending, this mindful cash management, this is the answer or the key to help defeat budgeting. So yes, you can live within your means through budgeting, but the two other ways to do it is to be more efficient within your means. That's the 4 I's, IRS, interest, investments, and insurance. Find ways to design those effectively to not tip the government, to not overpay to institutions on the interest that you have, to not have hidden fees or commissions that are non-performing that drag the performance of your investments. A lot of people have retirement plans with a bunch of legal fees or higher percentages of what they pay for that administration. And there's other self-directed IRAs that you might have a flat fee for the whole year. So now you've got all that extra money to put in your pocket versus go to an institution for something that might not be benefiting you. So the last one is insurance, duplicate coverages, improper structure. As I mentioned, if you have liquidity and savings, you can raise deductibles or have a multi-policy discount if you stay with the same company, or use an umbrella policy. An umbrella policy sits on top of your car and your home as an excess liability policy that's much more efficient, maybe a couple $100 for $1 million of coverage versus trying to raise the limits of liability on your car and your home. You do the minimum required for that umbrella policy to kick in. That better design means more protection with more money in your pocket. So those 4 I's, being more efficient within your means is the key. But the game changer goes back to fast money, a productive expense. When I put in $1 and more than $1 comes out, that's a productive expense. It's not about budgeting that. It's about increasing that to the point it's still effective. Now, if we keep putting money in, like if I'm running ads and I'm selling books with those ads, but they're not effective anymore, I want to start to eliminate the additional dollars because maybe I've already reached or saturated a market. And I'm going to monitor that over time. That's part of what's intentional and important with allocating and investing money. But most of us have been taught to set it and forget it, to not think about it, wait for the long haul. Hopefully 10, 20, 30 years down the road, it works out, but not knowing because we're not creating cash flow. There isn't enough accountability. So think about productive expenses. When you look at your expenses in mindful cash management, say, is there any expense that should be eliminated? Are there expenses that should be increased? Are there ones that should just be managed where you pay cash for them? See, budgeting is kind of a cousin to scarcity. And scarcity is the greatest destroyer of wealth. No amount of luck, no discipline, no rate of return, no financial advisor. None of that will save you if you're stuck in the scarcity mindset. Scarcity will kind of repel wealth instead of create it. And so if you're in scarcity thinking there's not enough, you got to hold on to what you got. You got to take what you can while you can. And that, I had a great aunt that had $550,000 in her savings account and applied for welfare because she saw that as off limits and still saw herself as poor, even though she had a huge amount of money she saved over her life. Because money and how we treat it is a mindset. If that mindset's all about reduction and budgeting, it's a limited game. So the fifth point is not differentiating expenses, which I've kind of talked about the 4 types. The first one is destructive expenses. Eliminate destructive expenses. Lifestyle expenses, pay cash for those. Your utilities, going out to eat, going on trips, just pay cash. The third, and what is often neglected, is a protective expense. Address these. Protective expenses could be that peace of mind fund, just seeing that as I got to set some money aside to have peace of mind. And at least 6 months. This notion of 3 to 6 months, that's kind of crazy. That's a 3-month difference. That's a huge number. 3 to 6 months, which is it, 3 or 6? I think that we get told 3 months because people think, I could never get to 6 months because I'm living paycheck to paycheck, or I have a cash flow crunch, or I just got this big unexpected tax bill. Having protective expenses, having the right team, having the peace of mind fund, having insurance to transfer risk so that you're not one financial surprise away from being derailed or having your finances destroyed. It's about asset protection, like the trust that you set up or the corporations that you have as a business owner. These are all critical components to protective expenses. And I feel like wealthy people really understand that well, but a lot of the middle class and even upper middle class neglect this, and it actually gives them setbacks because we all have a financial surprise sometime. Now, the last type of expense, we've talked about this one, a productive expense. Put more money into that, not less. And it helps you to grow your wealth, not just try to shrink your way there. So let's review these mistakes. If you don't value your time, you got to consider the opportunity cost of the time that you're investing or spending trying to save money, and what else could you be doing that might be more valuable? Maybe automating the wrong things, automatically locking money away in a retirement plan before you have your peace of mind fund. And now all of a sudden you're borrowing or you have high interest rates on a credit card while you're funding a retirement plan. Let's automate your savings, then deliberately invest in places that make sense based upon your investor DNA. Who are you? What kind of investor are you? When people don't separate accounts, they become susceptible to Parkinson's law. If you're not automatically setting money aside, and you can do that in a sweep account where it just automatically sweeps, you have it set up at your institution, you make a deposit, it automatically, takes a percentage and moves it over. And the mindset of trying to shrink your way to wealth, that's kind of the belief there's a finite pie. There's only so much to go around. If you believe that, then part of it's because a lack of understanding of velocity. What's velocity? Well, I'll draw it out here. Velocity is simply the GDP divided by the money supply, okay? So that's what is velocity, or V2. So M2 is the money supply. So the more times money circulates, the more output there is. So if I spend $1, it's not the end of that dollar's life. Someone else gets to take the dollar and use it again and again and again. And the more times there's goods and services and experiences, the more velocity, the more output. But if it's all about cutting back, shrinking, holding on to what we got, not actually going out there, other people are velocitizing. When you put your money in a savings account, the bank's velocitizing because they're lending that money out to someone else. And they're getting cash flow from that. So let's look at this on a personal level. Your GDP is your output divided by the inputs. Now, the mistake people make in personal velocity is they think, I'll just reduce my inputs. I'll spend less money. I'll budget. Or I'll take more risk. But if you take more risk, it doesn't guarantee a return. It's actually a new input. That's not necessarily good. Or if the government says, we'll print more money, well, that just waters down the soup. We've got to add value. There's got to be exchange. It's exchange that creates wealth. And here's the deal. All exchange is unequal, and that's why we can have win-wins. What do I mean by that? If you were to buy my book, Money Unmasked, let's see. It says it's $24.95. So if you buy this book for $24.95 and you just go to the chapter on recovering cash, and one strategy puts $1,000 into your pocket, look, you end up wealthier from this. You've given me $24.95, but I wrote the book. So I've already got it in my head. So the book's worth less than that to me because I already know it. But to you, not knowing it, it's worth more than that to you. So we both end up wealthier in that exchange. You get the knowledge, the insights, the tool. I get the money. We don't have equal exchange. I don't give you $1 for $1 back unless, you've got 4 quarters, and I guess we could exchange that. But this is what the great thing of a free market. I can take my money and engage someone else's best abilities of things I'm not good at. I remember I did a triathlon. Crazily, I mentioned on my radio show back in the day, I'm going to do a triathlon. Didn't know how to swim, worried I was going to drown. But I remember I had a Huffy bike at the time. Growing up in a small town, that's all I had. That's not a very good triathlon bike. So I went and looked at a triathlon bike. $4,700 for the Scott carbon fiber bike. And I first thought, man, this is expensive. And I thought, wait, if I tried to rebuild this bike, I couldn't do it over a lifetime. All the technology and insights that went into it for a company that specializes in it, I could give them $4,700 and free up my time to go earn the $4,700 in a much more efficient way. And this is where people might get caught trying to do all their own cleaning and mowing their lawn. And again, when you don't have the resources, that's a good idea until you can grow your wealth or until you grow your skill sets, till you learn how to add more value. But ultimately, there's a point where that's going to hold you back from doing what you do best. That's the highest scalable, leverageable, valuable activities that can produce way more money than you would save, right? So that's the key, is starting to think about exchange, not shrinking your way to wealth and reduction, but think production. And then make sure you differentiate your expenses because you want to increase the productive ones and eliminate the destructive ones. Not all expenses are created equal. So let me give you a little bit of a financial rant on this. When we believe in the finite pie and there's only so much to go around, we think that it's a world of competition. If one person has more, that's less for us. And so everything's competitive. I've got to take what I can. This is scarcity personified. If it's all about cutting back, there's only so much you can cut back and eliminate. And even if you're so good at that you end up with millions of dollars, what if you have no plan to ever enjoy that money, never benefit from that money? It's just stuck in a bank account. It's just stuck in a retirement plan. It's not translated into improving your life in any way, shape, or form. That's the problem with elimination, reduction, and budgeting. That's the problem, is the mindset, is the framework. Can it work? Yes. But then when you die, your heirs will probably blow the money because the millionaire next door talks about these people that are wearing the same jeans they bought 40 years ago, driving the same truck that's breaking down, so they have a bunch of money. But guess what? They're a broke millionaire or a miserable millionaire. It doesn't translate to quality of life. So, when I speak at events, people sometimes introduce me as Money Jesus, and it's flattering. But to be fair, I don't know that I really look like Jesus. I look more like Disney Jesus with all this gray hair, like old Jesus. I'm a good decade older than he was, right? So, but we can ask, what would Money Jesus do? Well, instead of budgeting, you'd use mindful cash management. Pay yourself first, automate that savings, and live off the rest. Differentiate your expenses. Increase the productive ones and eliminate the destructive ones. Monitor your money, but don't obsess about it. You've got to see leisure as worthwhile, quality of life as key. Most importantly, you got to see yourself as your greatest asset, not a stock, bond, budget, or, piece of real estate. It's you, your ability to create value, to serve others, to solve problems. So stop limiting your value. Stop diminishing your life. It's time for you to be responsible and free.